The room was a monument to sterile authority, a cold cathedral of federal power. The air, scrubbed clean and chilled to a precise 68 degrees, tasted of ozone and the faint bitter ghost of yesterday's coffee. Polished chrome and smoked glass reflected the merciless humming glow of recessed fluorescent lights, stripping all warmth and shadow from the faces of the men inside. It was a space designed to intimidate, to shrink the individual into a mere data point, a case file to be processed and closed. At the head of a long, obsidian table sat Special Agent Marcus Thorne, a man who wore his authority like a tailored suit, sharp, expensive, and utterly devoid of give. He was a product of a new generation of law enforcement, weaned on algorithms and biometric data, his faith placed firmly in the infallibility of the digital world he policed. His fingers, lean and restless, tapped an impatient rhythm on the screen of a government-issue tablet, its sleek surface a stark contrast to the woman seated opposite him. Ilara Vance was an anomaly in this world of hard angles and cold light. She was 78 years old, a small, bird-like woman wrapped in a soft, lavender-colored shawl that looked as if it had been knitted by hand from spun moonlight. Her face was a delicate map of wrinkles, each line a testament to a life lived far from the sterile confines of such a room. Her silver hair was pinned in a neat bun, and her hands, gnarled with a touch of arthritis, rested calmly on the worn leather of the purse in her lap. She did not fidget. She did not shrink under the oppressive weight of the room or the dismissive gaze of Agent Thorne. She simply sat, a portrait of quiet endurance, her presence a soft, organic counterpoint to the room's brutalist geometry. She was here because her grandson, Leo, a bright but reckless 17-year-old, had been swept up in a federal dragnet. He was accused of being part of a hacktivist collective that had done something foolish, and now the full, terrifying weight of the United States government was poised to crush him. Thorne finally looked up from his tablet, his eyes a flat, unimpressed gray. He had already read the file. Leo was a small fish, a nobody. This meeting was a procedural courtesy, a box to be checked before the kid was handed over to the prosecutors to be made an example of. The grandmother was an unexpected and, frankly, annoying complication. "Mr. Vance," he began, his voice crisp and devoid of empathy, "your grandson is facing a litany of federal charges: conspiracy to commit wire fraud, unauthorized access of a protected computer system. The list is extensive. We have him. The digital forensics are conclusive." He did not look at Ilara, addressing her as if she were merely a piece of furniture in the room. Ilara's gaze did not waver. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft but clear, carrying an unexpected resonance that cut through the low hum of the room's electronics. "His name is Ilara Vance," she corrected gently, "and I am not here to dispute what Leo did. He is a boy who made a foolish mistake. I am here to offer you something of far greater value in exchange for his leniency." A flicker of amusement crossed Thorne's face. He leaned back in his chair, the expensive leather groaning in protest. He steepled his fingers, a gesture of performative patience he had learned at Quantico. It was meant to convey intellectual superiority. "And what could you possibly offer the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Mr. Vance? A family recipe for apple pie?" The two junior agents flanking him chuckled on cue, a dry, sycophantic sound. The condescension washed over Ilara, leaving her utterly untouched. She was a stone wall against which his arrogance broke and dissipated. "There is a far greater threat developing," she said, her tone steady, as if explaining a simple fact of physics. "You are hunting minnows, while a leviathan prepares to breach the surface. The cyber attack on the port of Baltimore last week was not an isolated incident. It was a test, a proof of concept for a piece of malware so sophisticated it operates like a biological virus. It doesn't just break through firewalls, it rewrites their fundamental code, turning your defenses into its own weapons. You are looking for a hacker. You should be looking for a ghost." Thorne's smirk tightened. This was better than he had expected. The confused grandmother was also a conspiracy theorist. "We are well aware of the Chimera malware, Mr. Vance," he said, using the official FBI designation for the threat. "We have the best minds in the country working on it around the clock." The unspoken addendum hung in the air. What could you possibly know about it? "Your best minds are failing," Ilara stated, not as an insult, but as a diagnosis. They are failing because they see it as a foreign entity, a weapon to be dismantled. But it is not. It has a familiar signature, its core architecture. It is a perversion of a system I helped design half a century ago. The room went silent, the only sound the faint whir of a server fan in the adjoining room. Thorne stared at her, his mind struggling to process the sheer absurdity of her statement. He saw a frail old woman in a knitted shawl. He saw a grandmother trying to spin a fantastical tale to save her delinquent grandson. The cognitive dissonance was so vast, it tipped over into pure ridicule. He let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a cruel, ugly sound in the quiet room. "You designed it?" he repeated, his voice dripping with incredulous mockery. He looked around at his agents, sharing the joke. "Let me guess, you also knitted the first internet cable and taught Al Gore how to use email." The laughter was louder this time, more confident. Thorne felt a surge of control. He had her now. He would break down this ridiculous fantasy, and then he would break down her grandson. Ilara's calm remained absolute. It was this stillness, this refusal to be provoked, that began to infuriate him. It was as if she were operating in a different reality, one where his authority and his scorn had no purchase. "I can stop it," she said simply. "But for you to understand that, you must first understand who I am. And since you are a man who only believes what his screens tell him, I will offer you a demonstration." Thorne leaned forward, his elbows on the table, the smirk now a predatory grin. The game was afoot. He would let her play it out, let her humiliate herself so completely that there would be nothing left of her absurd proposition. "A demonstration?" he purred. "I'm intrigued. What are you going to do? Knit a decryption key?" "No," Ilara said, her eyes meeting his. For the first time, Thorne felt a strange, unnerving sensation, a feeling that he was the one being analyzed, weighed, and found wanting. "I can access any system you place in front of me. Your network, your servers, anything. I am telling you this so you will understand that when I speak of Chimera, I am not speculating. I am speaking as an architect would about a flaw in their own building." This was the moment, the peak of her delusion. Thorne saw his opening, a chance to crush her utterly and publicly. He stood up and gestured with a grand, theatrical sweep of his arm toward a hardened terminal in the corner of the room. It was a direct line to the FBI's most secure internal network, the Strategic Information and Operations Center, or SIOC. It was protected by layers of authentication, biometric scanners, and quantum encryption. It was, for all intents and purposes, unbreachable. "Be my guest," Thorne announced, his voice booming in the enclosed space. He turned to the other agents, a wide, triumphant grin on his face. "You all heard her? Grandma says she's a hacker. She's going to break into SIOC for us." He let the statement hang in the air, the absurdity of it echoing in the ensuing silence, which was quickly broken by a fresh wave of snickering. "Go on, then," he said, his voice cracking like a whip as he turned back to Ilara. "Show us your magic." The air in the room thickened with a mixture of pity and cruel anticipation. The junior agents shifted on their feet, avoiding eye contact with the old woman, as if her impending embarrassment were a communicable disease. To them, this was a sad, pathetic spectacle. A desperate grandmother, lost in a world of fantasy, about to be brutally reintroduced to reality by their boss, a man who savored such moments. Agent Thorne stood with his arms crossed, a monument to his own certainty, his face radiating a smug triumph. He had cornered her. He had exposed her lie. The game, he believed, was over. But Alara Vance did not move. She did not approach the terminal. She simply sat there, her hands still resting on her purse, her gaze fixed on him. Her silence was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of a grandmaster contemplating a chessboard, seeing not just the next move, but the entire arc of the game, all the way to its inevitable conclusion. This unnerving calm, this complete lack of fear or panic, began to eat at Thorne. It was a loose thread in the tight fabric of his control. He had expected tears, pleading, a stammered retraction. He had not expected this placid defiance. "What's the matter?" he taunted, his voice a little sharper now, a little louder. "Did you forget your glasses? Or perhaps the password is written on a piece of paper in your other shawl?" The joke fell flat. The laughter from his subordinates was weaker this time, tinged with a growing discomfort. The scene was tipping from amusing into something cruel. Alara's eyes finally shifted from Thorne to a young man standing near the door. He was Agent Miller, a junior technician from the Cyber Division, brought in to manage the room's AV equipment. He was young, with a perpetually worried expression and glasses that were slightly too big for his face. Unlike the others, he wasn't smirking. He was watching Alara with an intense, conflicted curiosity. There was something about her that resonated with a story his own grandfather, a retired engineer from Bell Labs, used to tell. Stories of the pioneers, the quiet geniuses who built the digital world with slide rules and punch cards, long before men like Thorne ever touched a keyboard. Thorne's patience finally snapped. The old woman's silent refusal to play his game was a direct challenge to his authority in front of his men. "All right, we're done here," he barked, his voice echoing off the glass walls. He jabbed a finger toward the door. "Agents, escort Mr. Vance out, and book her grandson on every charge we can find. No deals, no leniency. Throw the book at him so hard it breaks the binding." Two burly agents moved to flank Alara, their hands ready to take her arms. But as they approached, she finally spoke again, her voice still soft, yet it cut through the room like a shard of ice. "The book you're using," she said, her eyes still locked on Miller, "is written in a language you no longer understand." It was then that Miller saw it. Pinned to the soft lavender wool of her shawl was a small, unassuming piece of jewelry. It was a tiny, stylized pin made of tarnished silver, shaped like an owl with two small, inset sapphire eyes. It was an image he had seen only once before, in a heavily redacted, declassified document he had studied at the Academy. It was the insignia of the Mythical Signal Intelligence Unit 73, a clandestine group of cryptographers and engineers from the Cold War era. They were ghosts, legends whispered about in the deepest, darkest corners of the intelligence community. They were the architects, the ones who had built the very foundations of American cyber defense before it even had a name. They were known by a single, terrifying moniker: Prometheus. As the agents reached for her, Alara shifted her gaze from the pin to Miller's eyes. She saw the flicker of recognition, the dawning horror and understanding. She had found her audience. She said a single word, her voice barely a whisper, meant only for him. Oracle. It was not a name, it was a key, a code word from a forgotten age, a distress signal reserved for a scenario codenamed Broken Arrow, the imminent failure of the nation's core defense protocols at the hands of one of their own creations. Miller felt the blood drain from his face. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The stories his grandfather had told, the redacted documents he had studied, they weren't history. They were here, in this room, wearing a lavender shawl. While Thorne was turning away, basking in the glow of his perceived victory, Miller moved. He took 2 steps back, melting into the shadows near the doorway. With trembling hands, he pulled out his secure access phone. He knew what he was about to do was a career-ending, and possibly life-ending, gamble. He was a junior technician about to bypass the entire FBI chain of command. including a decorated special agent in charge, based on the whisper of a 78-year-old woman and a half-forgotten legend. But the look in Ilara Vance's eyes was not the look of a liar. It was the look of a queen whose castle was about to fall. He slipped out of the briefing room and into a small soundproofed communications closet. His fingers flew across the keypad, dialing a number he had been given by his mentor at the NSA, a number he had memorized and been instructed to use only if he ever witnessed something that he believed, with absolute certainty, represented a clear and present existential threat to the United States. He had always assumed it was a hyperbolic test. He had been wrong. Meanwhile, Ilara had been led to a small, sterile holding area, a glass-walled box with a single metal bench. She sat down, her posture still ramrod straight. The two agents stood outside, looking awkward and uncertain. The fire had gone out of the confrontation, leaving behind the cold ash of their own complicity. Ilara closed her eyes, and the sterile white room dissolved. She was no longer in a federal building in 2024. She was in a windowless subterranean bunker in 1968. The air was thick with the smell of hot vacuum tubes and solder. The sound was a constant symphony of whirring tape reels and the rhythmic clatter of teletype machines. She was 22 years old, a prodigy in mathematics and theoretical computing, plucked from MIT by a man with no name and brought to a place that did not exist on any map. She was part of Project Prometheus. They were a small team, a dozen brilliant misfit minds, tasked with a monumental, impossible goal: to build a digital fortress, a communications network that could survive a nuclear war. She remembered the long nights fueled by black coffee and sheer intellectual ferocity. She remembered the chalkboards filled with equations that looked like a form of arcane magic. And she remembered her partner, a brilliant, fiercely patriotic young analyst named Sterling. Together, they had designed the core of the system. She was the architect, the one who dreamed up the elegant, unbreakable structures. He was the strategist, the one who foresaw every possible line of attack, every potential vulnerability. They had called her Oracle, for her uncanny ability to predict the future of the code, to see the exploits that would exist decades before the technology to implement them was even invented. They had poured their youth, their genius, their very souls into that code. It was their child. And now that child had become a monster. The Chimera malware wasn't just using her work. It was a twisted, cancerous reflection of it, a dark mirror of her own creation. The ghost in the machine was her own. Back in the comms closet, the phone on the other end of the line was answered on the first ring. The voice was gravelly, impatient, and radiated an authority that made the air in the tiny room feel thin. "This is Sterling." Miller's own voice was a dry croak. "Director Sterling," he stammered, the name itself feeling like a physical weight. He was speaking to the legendary, almost mythical, director of the National Security Agency. "My name is Agent Miller, FBI Cyber Division. Sir, I have reason to believe we have a Code Prometheus event." There was a dead, chilling silence on the other end of the line. For a moment, Miller thought the director had hung up. Then Sterling's voice returned, but it was completely changed. The impatience was gone, replaced by a terrifying, Arctic calm. "Give me the designator." "Sir," Miller whispered, his throat tight, "the designator is Oracle." The silence that followed was even more profound. Miller could hear the sound of his own blood rushing in his ears. He had just invoked a name that had likely not been spoken aloud in a government facility for 30 years. He had lit a fuse without knowing where the bomb was. Finally, Sterling spoke again, his voice now a low, urgent command that tolerated no argument. "Son, I want you to listen to me very carefully. Lock down your entire floor. No one gets in or out. No data transfers, no external communications. Go back to that room and stand guard over the woman you mentioned. Do not let anyone, and I mean anyone, touch her or speak to her. Your life and the lives of everyone in that building now depend on her safety. I am on my way." The line went dead. Miller stumbled out of the closet, his legs shaking. He had done it. He had either just saved the country or ended his life. He wasn't sure which. On a secure military airstrip just outside Washington, D.C., a different kind of storm was gathering. The call from Agent Miller had triggered a cascade of protocols that had lain dormant for decades. Within 60 seconds of hanging up, Director Sterling was striding across the tarmac, his face a grim mask of stone. A fleet of black, unmarked VH-60N helicopters, the kind typically reserved for presidential transport, were already spinning up their rotors, their downdraft whipping the director's coat around him. This was not a standard response. This was a full-scale mobilization of the highest echelons of the United States Cyber Command. A 4-star general, the head of Cybercom himself, met Sterling at the helicopter door, his face pale and grim. "Is it confirmed, John?" the general asked, his voice nearly lost in the thundering roar of the engines. Sterling didn't break stride. "The designator was Oracle," he shouted back. "It's her." The general's face went rigid with shock. He, too, knew the legends. He followed Sterling into the helicopter without another word. The mobilization was swift, brutal, and absolute. Air traffic controllers in a 50-mile radius were ordered to clear the skies. A motorcade of black armored SUVs, filled with elite special operations forces, was dispatched to form a ground perimeter around the FBI field office. This wasn't just an intervention. It was an invasion. A surgical strike of overwhelming force aimed not at an enemy, but at the heart of another federal agency. The message was clear and uncompromising. Something had gone terribly, horribly wrong, and the old guard was coming to fix it. Inside the FBI briefing room, the atmosphere had soured. Thorne's triumphant mood had evaporated, replaced by a simmering, petty anger. The adrenaline of the confrontation had faded, and now he was just an arrogant man in a room with a problem he couldn't solve. He was pacing back and forth, dictating a memo to one of his junior agents, outlining the charges against Leo Vance, layering them on thick, making it personal. He was using the full power of his office to punish the boy for the quiet defiance of his grandmother. Agent Miller had slipped back into the room, his face a mask of feigned neutrality. He took up a position near the door to the holding area where Ilar was kept, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm. He was following his orders. He was now her guardian. Thorne noticed his posture and scowled. "Miller, what are you doing? Go back to your lab. The show's over." "Sorry, sir," Miller said, his voice surprisingly firm. "New orders. This section of the floor is on lockdown. No one in or out until further notice." Thorne stopped pacing. "New orders? From who? I am the special agent in charge of this floor. I give the orders here." "I'm afraid my orders supersede yours, sir," Miller said, meeting his gaze. The sheer audacity of the statement left Thorne momentarily speechless. A junior tech was defying him. Before he could unleash the full torrent of his fury, the world outside the briefing room's glass walls erupted into controlled chaos. Agents in the outer office were scrambling, shouting into their radios. Through the windows, the sky darkened as the fleet of black helicopters descended like a swarm of angry hornets, their rotors beating the air into submission. Then, the doors to the briefing room burst open. They didn't fly off their hinges with a crash. They were opened with a chilling, synchronized precision by 2 soldiers in full tactical gear, their faces hidden behind blast shields. The room, which had been buzzing with Thorne's angry energy, was plunged into an absolute, suffocating silence. Into that silence walked a procession of pure, unadulterated power. 4 men in the immaculate dress uniforms of the United States military, their chests a constellation of medals and ribbons, their shoulders heavy with the stars of generals, and at their center, walking with a measured, deliberate gait, was a man in a simple, perfectly tailored gray suit. He was older, his hair white and his face lined with the burdens of a lifetime spent in the shadows, but his eyes were chips of blue ice, radiating an intensity that seemed to suck the very air out of the room. This was Director John Sterling. Thorne's jaw went slack. His brain, which a moment ago had been consumed with petty vengeance, was now screaming a single, panicked question. What is happening? He recognized Sterling, of course. Everyone in federal law enforcement recognized the director of the NSA. To have him appear in your office, unannounced and flanked by a military command staff, was the professional equivalent of having a meteor strike your desk. Sterling's icy gaze swept across the room, dismissing the stunned FBI agents as if they were nothing more than furniture. He completely and utterly ignored Special Agent Marcus Thorne, who stood frozen in the center of the room, his authority evaporating like mist in a hurricane. Sterling's eyes scanned the space until they found the small, glass-walled holding cell. He saw her. He walked directly toward the cell, his polished leather shoes making no sound on the tiled floor. The generals parted for him, forming a protective cordon behind him. Agent Miller, his heart pounding, unlocked the door and stepped aside. Sterling entered the small enclosure and stood before Ilara Vance, who had risen to her feet. The two old friends, who had not seen each other in nearly 40 years, looked at one another. A universe of shared history, of triumphs and sacrifices, passed between them in that silent gaze. Then, to the absolute, jaw-dropping astonishment of every single person in the room, Director John Sterling, one of the most powerful men in the world, drew himself up to his full height, clicked his heels together, and executed a formal bow from the waist. It was not a gesture of greeting. It was a gesture of profound, reverential respect, the kind a student might show a revered master. "Oracle," he said. His voice, which had been so cold and hard, was now thick with emotion. "It has been too long. I'm so sorry it took us this long to find you." Thorne finally found his voice, a pathetic, stammering squeak that was an insult to the silence. Director Sterling, what is the meaning of this? This woman she's the grandmother of a suspect. She's a civilian." Sterling straightened up, but he did not turn to face Thorne. He kept his back to him, a deliberate, calculated insult of devastating proportions. He was refusing to even acknowledge Thorne's existence. He addressed his next words to the entire room, his voice now ringing with the cold, clear authority of absolute command. "This woman," he began, the words cutting through the air like tempered steel, "is Ilara Vance. To those of us who built the world you now take for granted, she is known as Oracle. She is the lead architect and chief cryptographer of the original Prometheus Protocol." He paused, letting the name hang in the air, a name that was a whisper of legend to most, but a thunderclap of truth to the few who knew. The entire cybersecurity infrastructure of this nation, the very bedrock upon which the NSA, the Department of Defense, and yes, even the FBI built their digital houses, grew from the seeds of her genius. The firewalls you hide behind, the encryption you think is yours, the very language your systems speak, she wrote it. She didn't just design a system. She designed the principles of digital security itself. He finally turned, his movement slow and deliberate, and pinned Thorne with a gaze so filled with contempt that Thorne physically recoiled, taking a step back. "She is not a civilian. She is a national treasure, a living monument whose service to this country is so profound and so secret that men like you will never even have the security clearance to read her file. And you." Sterling's voice dropped to a low, dangerous growl, and he took a step toward the terrified agent. "You put her in a cage. You called her grandma, and you dared her to do her magic." The color drained from Thorne's face, leaving behind a pasty, sickly white. His skin seemed to shrink against his bones. He was no longer a predator. He was prey, frozen in the headlights of an oncoming train. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His career, his reputation, his entire sense of self-worth was being systematically dismantled in front of his own subordinates. The chimera malware that is currently holding our nation's critical infrastructure hostage? Sterling continued, his voice rising again, a prosecutor delivering his final, damning summation. "It is a mutated, weaponized version of her own foundational code, a ghost from a machine she herself built. She is not just the only person who can stop it, she is the only person on this planet who truly understands it. She came here to offer you a miracle, to save you from an enemy you cannot even comprehend. And you were about to throw her out and prosecute her grandson for sport. Sterling turned to the 4-star general at his side. General, place Special Agent Thorne under immediate arrest. He is relieved of all duties, effective immediately. I want a full investigation into his conduct, his cases, his entire career. He is a threat to national security. Secure all his devices, his files, and his access. As of this moment, he no longer exists. 2 military police officers, who had entered silently behind the command staff, stepped forward. They moved with an efficient, impersonal grace. They did not speak to Thorne. They flanked him, took his arms, and deftly removed his sidearm and his badge. They secured his hands behind his back with a pair of black zip ties. The click of the plastic locking was the loudest sound in the now silent room. It was the sound of a career, a life, ending. Marcus Thorne, the arrogant authority, was now a prisoner, stripped of his power in the very room that had been his throne. He was rendered utterly, completely speechless, his humiliation absolute and public. The reversal was as swift as it was total. The entire power dynamic of the room had been inverted in a matter of minutes. The FBI agents who had been snickering at Alara now stood rigidly at attention, their faces a mixture of fear and awe. The chrome and glass that had once reflected Thorne's authority now seemed to magnify his humiliation. Director Sterling turned his back on the disgraced agent, dismissing him from his reality. He approached Alara, his expression softening from righteous fury to deep, genuine concern. "Alara," he said, his voice now gentle, "my deepest apologies for this unforgivable incompetence. The system has grown arrogant and forgotten its creators. We are in desperate need of your help." "The boy, Leo," Alara said, her first concern not for herself, but for her grandson. "He is just a child, John. He was curious, not malicious." "Consider it done," Sterling said without a moment's hesitation. He gestured to one of his aides. "Locate Leo Vance. He is to be released from custody immediately with a full and unconditional apology. All charges are dropped. His record is to be expunged. He is not a suspect. He is now a consultant under my personal authority. Bring him here." The order was relayed, and within moments the machinery of the state began to reverse itself. Charges that had been ironclad were suddenly nothing more than digital dust. The system that had been poised to crush a teenage boy was now tripping over itself to exonerate him. Alara was no longer a prisoner. She was the epicenter of a new command structure. Sterling and the generals flanked her, forming a protective detail, a human shield of immense power. They began to escort her from the briefing room, not as a civilian being led away, but as a commander being led to the battlefield. As they passed the now handcuffed Marcus Thorne, who stood waiting for his own escort into oblivion, Alara paused. She looked at the broken man, and in her eyes there was no triumph, no "I told you so." There was only a profound, weary sadness. It was the sadness of an architect seeing their creation misused, of a teacher seeing their lessons forgotten. "The most dangerous vulnerability in any system is not in the code, young man," she said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of immutable truth. "It is in the hubris of the men who operate it. You looked at me and saw a stereotype, a caricature from your own limited imagination. You did not see a person. You did not see a potential solution. That was your exploit, and the enemy found it." Thorne could not meet her gaze. He stared at the floor, his face a mask of shame, the full weight of his failure crashing down upon him. He had been so sure of his power, so certain of his world, and she had shattered it all, not with a weapon, but with a quiet, unyielding truth. Alara and her honor guard swept out of the room, leaving Thorne in the wreckage of his career. They moved through the corridors of the FBI building like a royal procession. Alarms had been silenced, lockdowns lifted, but a new kind of order had been imposed. Agents and staff flattened themselves against the walls as they passed, their faces a mixture of confusion and terror. They were witnessing a shift in the very firmament of their world, a higher authority descending to correct a grievous error. They arrived at the building's primary command center, a vast, darkened room filled with dozens of analysts sitting before a wall of massive screens. The screens were a chaotic tapestry of red alerts, cascading error messages, and maps showing critical infrastructure failures across the country. The air was thick with tension and the low murmur of panicked voices. The nation's best and brightest were losing. As Sterling and his entourage entered, a hush fell over the room. Every analyst turned, their faces pale in the glow of their monitors. The general from Cybercom stepped forward. "Status report," he commanded. A harried-looking section chief stood up, his voice trembling slightly. "Sir, Chimera it's evolving. Every time we build a countermeasure, it adapts. It's not just bypassing our firewalls, it's consuming them. It's rewriting their core programming in real time. We've lost control of the Eastern Seaboard's power grid. The financial markets are next. It's like it's alive, sir. We've never seen anything like it." Sterling looked at Alara. "This is your battlefield now, Oracle." She walked forward, her small frame cutting a path through the sea of high-tech equipment. She approached the main command console, the central nexus of the entire operation. The young analyst sitting there scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide. Alara looked at the wall of chaotic data, and for a long moment she was perfectly still. She was not just looking at the code, she was listening to it, feeling its rhythm, its diseased, corrupted heartbeat. She recognized its structure, the ghost of her own logic twisted into a weapon of pure chaos. "He was clever," she murmured almost to herself. "He didn't try to break my locks. He taught them a new language." She then sat down at the console. The room held its breath. All eyes were on the small, elderly woman in the lavender shawl. She placed her hands, those hands that Thorne had seen as frail and useless, over the keyboard. And then she began to type. It was not the frantic, percussive typing of the other analysts. It was a fluid, elegant dance. Her fingers moved with a speed and precision that seemed impossible, a blur of motion that was both graceful and terrifyingly efficient. She was not hacking. She was not fighting the system. She was communing with it. She was a composer returning to her own symphony, finding the discordant notes and, with a few deft, masterful strokes, rewriting the score. She didn't use brute force to break down doors. She used the master keys, the hidden backdoors and forgotten command pathways she herself had woven into the fabric of the code 50 years ago, secret signatures known only to the architect. Lines of code, elegant and luminous, scrolled across the main screen, replacing the red alerts. She was not attacking Chimera. She was deconstructing it, line by line, isolating its malignant core and starving it of the very logic it used to survive. The analysts in the room watched, their faces transformed from panic to utter, humbled awe. They were witnessing something that would be spoken of in legends for decades to come. They were watching a ghost reclaim her machine. In less than 10 minutes, it was over. The red alerts on the giant wall map winked out one by one, replaced by calming, stable green. The cascading error messages vanished. The power grid in the east stabilized. The threat to the financial markets evaporated. She had not just stopped the attack, she had annihilated it, tracing its source back to a non-extradition country, flagging the accounts that funded it, and erecting a new, evolved defense based on Chimera's own mutated logic, a shield forged from the enemy's sword. She had done in 10 minutes what the combined might of the U.S. Cyber Command had failed to do in 10 days. She typed one final command. On the central screen, a single word appeared in simple, white text: secure. Ilara took her hands off the keyboard and leaned back in the chair, a soft sigh escaping her lips. The command center was utterly silent for a long moment, and then, spontaneously, it erupted. It started with one analyst, then another, then the entire room. They rose to their feet and began to applaud. It was not the polite applause of a briefing. It was a thunderous, heartfelt ovation, a raw expression of respect and gratitude for the quiet master who had come from the past to save their future. The epilogue of Marcus Thorne's career was written not in commendations and promotions, but in the cold, bureaucratic language of a dishonorable discharge. The investigation, spearheaded by the Inspector General's office at the insistence of Director Sterling, was swift and merciless. It uncovered a pattern of arrogance, of cutting corners, of bullying subordinates, and of prioritizing easy convictions over complex truths. His treatment of Elara Vance was merely the final, most catastrophic symptom of a deeper disease. He was stripped of his title, his pension, and his reputation. He became a pariah, a cautionary tale whispered to new recruits at Quantico, a case study in how hubris could be a greater threat than any foreign adversary. He vanished from the world of federal law enforcement, eventually taking a low-level IT security job in the private sector, a ghost haunted by the memory of the day his world was dismantled by a quiet old woman. The events of that day sent shockwaves through the intelligence community. Director Sterling, using the full weight of his authority and the political capital gained from averting a national disaster, instituted sweeping reforms. The Oracle Protocol was born. It was a new directive, classified at the highest levels, that established a formal council of retired pioneers from the Prometheus generation, the aging, forgotten geniuses who had built the digital world. They were to be consulted on all major cyber defense initiatives. The protocol's opening line, written by Sterling himself, was a direct rebuke to the culture Thorne had embodied. Expertise is not a function of age, rank, or appearance. It is a function of knowledge. We will no longer be blind to the wisdom we have allowed to grow old in the shadows. Agent Miller, for his courage and perception, was promoted and made the first official liaison to the new council. His career launched into the stratosphere. He had bet his future on a ghost story, and it had paid off beyond his wildest dreams. Elara Vance wanted no part of the fame or the power that was offered to her. She turned down a Presidential Medal of Freedom and a permanent, high-paying position as a senior advisor. She asked for only two things. First, a full, unconditional pardon for her grandson, Leo, and second, a quiet endowment of a scholarship in her name at MIT for gifted but underprivileged students in computer science. Her requests were granted without question. Leo, now free and with a future brighter than he could have ever imagined, became the first recipient. Elara returned to her small, quiet house with its meticulously tended rose garden. She went back to her knitting, her books, and her life of peaceful anonymity. To her neighbors, she was once again just Mr. Vance, the kind, elderly woman who baked cookies for the local bake sale. But now, sitting on a small table by her favorite armchair, was a simple, slate-gray satellite phone. It had only one button. It was a direct, encrypted line to Director Sterling's office. She remained the silent guardian, the oracle in her garden, a ghost in the machine who could be called upon when the world she had built needed its architect once more. 1 year later, a man came to her house. He was thinner than before, his expensive suit replaced by simple, nondescript clothes. His face was etched with a humility that had been forged in the fires of public disgrace. It was Marcus Thorne. He stood at the edge of her garden, watching her prune her roses, his hands shoved nervously in his pockets. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its former arrogance. She turned, her expression unreadable. I came to apologize," he stammered. "What I did was inexcusable. I was arrogant. I was wrong, and I am truly, deeply sorry." Elara finished snipping a dead rose from its stem and looked at him. She did not offer him easy forgiveness or comforting platitudes. The damage he had done, the risk he had created, was too great for that. Instead, she gestured with her pruning shears to a small green watering can sitting by the garden hose. "Apologies are words, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice neither warm nor cold, but simply factual. "They are a necessary beginning, but they do not by themselves make things grow again. Actions are what rebuild things." She paused, her gaze steady. "The roses need watering." For a long moment, he just stood there. Then a slow understanding dawned in his eyes. He walked over, picked up the watering can, and turned on the spigot. He filled it to the brim and began to move slowly, carefully through her garden, tending to the flowers. In that simple, humbling act of service, in the quiet garden of the woman whose life he had almost destroyed, Marcus Thorne began the long, arduous process of earning his own redemption. And the oracle, her work done, turned back to her roses, a silent guardian tending to the world she had saved.